Another year is coming to an end, which means we are treated to another annual release of Call of Duty. For those who aren't keeping track, this is the 20th year in a row that Activision and then eventually Microsoft has released a mainline Call of Duty game. In fact, since the original Call of Duty in 2003, the franchise has seen 52 different entries, including games on handheld devices like the PSP and Nintendo DS, modern games that can be played on your iPhone, and even obscure releases from the mid-2000s that you could have downloaded on your BlackBerry. Despite public opinion fluctuating over the years with some of the most iconic games of all time, both good and bad, Call of Duty has maintained its cultural significance and continues to dominate financially, generating billions of dollars every single year. 2024 has given us the sixth entry in the Black Ops series, serving as a direct sequel to Black Ops Cold War, which was released 4 years ago in 2020. Cold War served as a series reboot after Black Ops 3 deviated almost entirely from the story in Black Ops 1 and 2, and after Black Ops 4 launched as a fully priced game without a main campaign. Cold War was both a sequel and a prequel, taking place after the 1960s campaign of the first game, but before the late 80s sections of Black Ops 2. Set between 1981 and 1984, Cold War saw the return of Alex Mason, Frank Woods, and Jason Hudson, although each of them have been recasted. Cold War succeeded with evolving Call of Duty's formula with meaningful and immersive gameplay additions, while also providing a compelling espionage story that was tied to real historical events and figures of the 1980s Cold War era. You played as a voiceless protagonist named Bell, and for arguably the first time in the series, Cold War introduced dialogue options when in conversations with characters. The character with the most screen time was the newly introduced Russell Adler, an interesting and mysterious character who most fans would agree is one of the best in the Black Ops series. The spy story and gameplay, along with real-life historical figures and events, combined to create one of the best Call of Duty campaigns and Black Ops narratives. Ignoring the third and fourth game in the series, Black Ops 6 is the first game outside of the future sections in Black Ops 2 to leave behind the Cold War setting. This time the story is set during the often forgotten Gulf War of the early 1990s. As the Soviet Union neared its quick and sudden demise, America and its military-industrial complex was in need of a new global threat. Luckily enough for them, Saddam Hussein set Iraqi forces to invade Kuwait, which triggered the Gulf War. In response, several dozen countries formed the coalition forces, led by the United States, who at this point was the only remaining global superpower. The coalition forces launched Operation Desert Shield, which was an air campaign that began on August 2, 1990. A few months later saw the start of the more widely known Operation Desert Storm, which was a ground campaign that began on January 17, 1991, and was composed almost entirely of American soldiers and equipment. It was a swift and decisive victory for the coalition forces, as the conflict ended 1 month later on February 28th. The Gulf War is one of the most underrepresented and least talked about wars in American history. Countless movies, shows, and video games are set during World War II, the Vietnam War, and the 21st Century War on Terror. To be fair, World War II was the deadliest conflict in world history, and both the Vietnam War and the War on Terror lasted for 2 decades, with America's fight against terrorism ongoing to this day. Outside of the Korean War, the Gulf War is arguably the most overlooked American conflict, likely because the ground invasion only lasted for a month, and warfare in the Middle East would later be outshined by the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan. To my knowledge, there hasn't been a single notable video game depicting the Gulf War that has released within the past 2 decades, although there have been a handful of recognizable Gulf War movies, the most popular one being Jarhead. At the end of May, the teaser trailer for Call of Duty Black Ops 6 released, which showcased uncanny depictions of real-life historical figures, like the former US Presidents Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush, former Chiefs of Staff and Secretary of State Colin Powell, the longest-serving Prime Minister of the United Kingdom Margaret Thatcher, and the infamous dictator of Iraq Saddam Hussein. I get that majority of Call of Duty players get excited every year for the updated COD multiplayer, or every other year for the new Black Ops Zombies, but there's a large minority of people who only play the campaign. With that in mind, fans were eager for the new Black Ops, especially after last year's god-awful $70 update in Modern Warfare 3. Most were anticipating new gameplay improvements like Omni Movement, many were hoping for a return to form with the Zombies game mode, and plenty of fans were intrigued by a main campaign that would maintain the Black Ops tradition of featuring real-life historical figures. While everyone has been praising the story and characters of Black Ops 6, I found myself mainly disappointed with what Treyarch cooked up. In my opinion, Black Ops 6 completely wasted the Gulf War period, as the narrative of the main campaign has little, if any, connections to real-life events and historical figures. I know I'm making a really big deal about this, but the Call of Duty franchise was built upon history, and the Black Ops series has always leaned into that, serving as period pieces for World War II, the 1960s, the 1980s, and now the 1990s. But unlike previous games in the series, Black Ops 6 doesn't incorporate US presidents, government officials, foreign leaders, or even dictators. For instance, in the very first mission of Black Ops 1, Mason, Woods, and Bowman take part in the Bay of Pigs invasion on April 17, 1961, assassinating Fidel Castro, or at least his body double. After sacrificing himself in order for his crew to escape, Mason is captured and sent to the Soviet labor camp Vorkuta, which was an actual real-life gulag within the USSR, although it was out of commission in real life by the time Mason is sent there in the second mission. After escaping, Mason is sent to the Pentagon, where he converses with real-life Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and 35th President John F. Kennedy. Following this, Mason and Woods are deployed on a covert mission to Kazakhstan in order to sabotage the Soviet space program. As the story unfolds, Mason fights in several historical battles and locations of the Vietnam War, with other missions set in real-life areas like the densely populated city of Kowloon, the Ural Mountains located in the Soviet Union, and more. Black Ops 1 weaves its fictional CIA narrative into real-life events, locations, and historical figures, culminating in an ending that solidifies its historical significance by hinting that the main character had a role in JFK's assassination. While Call of Duty World at War and Black Ops 1 both placed a heavy emphasis on history, future games in the Black Ops universe began to diverge from strict historical precedent. Black Ops 2 split its narrative, with missions set in 2025 and flashbacks taking place in the 1980s. Even then, Treyarch made sure to include real history, with Mason participating in the Angolan Civil War alongside General Jonas Savimbi, engaging in missions across Panama with multiple appearances by the infamous Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega, and even taking part in conflicts within Soviet-occupied Afghanistan. I understand that Call of Duty and the Black Ops series has taken plenty of liberties with their historical portrayals, with some missions being entirely fictional, dates for real events being inaccurate, weapons showing up in-game years before they were actually invented or mass-produced, and geography and architecture that can often differ from reality. Some actions by the main characters, particularly the Americans, would never fly in real life, with certain operations that could easily be considered acts of war against the Soviet Union. Yet, developers of the earlier Call of Duty games still emphasized historical authenticity and faithfulness, even as they deviated from history for entertainment value. After all, these games are US military propaganda pieces with the high-energy, explosive flair of a Michael Bay action movie. After the futuristic 2065 setting of Black Ops 3 and the non-existent campaign of Black Ops 4, Black Ops Cold War revisited the past to further explore the Cold War era. However, while moments in Black Ops 1 and pieces of Black Ops 2 were based on or inspired by real history, Black Ops Cold War has little to do with actual history. With fictional espionage and war missions that take the characters to 1980s East Berlin and Cuba, while also returning to the Vietnam War. Black Ops Cold War was much less faithful to real-world history, but the game still felt authentic to the era by being inspired by historical rumors like the Russian spy Perseus, and incorporating real-life figures like Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. Black Ops 6 continues the trends set by the previous entries by also not having much of any history. Certain missions take you to historical locations like Kuwait, where you get to see the most iconic image of the Gulf War, the burning oil fields. During Operation Desert Storm, as Iraqi forces retreated, they actually lit fire to the oil fields, wasting over $1 billion to prevent the coalition forces, mainly the United States, from obtaining Iraqi oil. This is real history that the game unfortunately does not teach you. I instead learned this from a Mr. Beat video. Shout out to Mr. Beat. Other missions take place in Iraq, with one dropping the player into an open section of the desert, giving you a car, crew, and multiple main and side objectives. This mission feels a lot like the open world of Metal Gear Solid 5, but of course Call of Duty doesn't have the same stealth gameplay and immersion. One thing that's annoying about this mission is that the car you drive easily gets damaged, which resulted in the car exploding in my playthrough, requiring me to traverse to the final objective on foot. Still, this is a standout mission within the game that I thoroughly enjoyed. I can admit where I hold my bias, as I found that I was more likely to enjoy missions set in active war zones, like the following mission where you perform a raid on one of Saddam Hussein's palaces, and another where you perform an assault on a Kuwait airfield, where the final moment sees you take control of a tank. Besides the military operations and the spy missions, the game features two different psychological levels. The first mission sees the main character inhale a biological weapon, which causes him to lose his mind and fight off an endless round of zombies. The mission requires you to enter different sections of a top-secret government laboratory in order to find different keycards. This is another standout mission of the game, as the COD experience is flipped onto its head, feeling more like a horror game, especially with the inclusion of weeping angels. Most of, if not all, the missions are enjoyable, but I was severely disappointed in the lack of history. Black Ops 6 only has one noticeable inclusion of a real-life historical figure. Some of you might already be aware of it, but here it is. The lack of historical figures is a big deal because it makes the entire narrative feel like a fantasy instead of something that could have actually happened. It doesn't help that the game's main threat is a made-up private militia called the Pantheon. Furthermore, there's a CIA corruption plotline throughout the entire story, and although it wasn't executed poorly, it could have been so much stronger with the inclusion of real-life government officials. Like, why would the game market a teaser trailer with Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush, Colin Powell, Margaret Thatcher, and Saddam Hussein if only one of them would make an appearance, and Bill Clinton doesn't even interact with the main character or have a speaking role? There's plenty of moments in the game that could potentially be based off of real-life events, but nothing is presented as history, especially with the lack of real-world footage and photos that the previous games had incorporated so well. If we're being real, Treyarch was probably too scared to tell a corruption story that implicated American government officials from only 30 years ago, but I still think that the story would have benefited tremendously from a stronger historical foundation. Not only was I disappointed with the main campaign's lack of real history, I was also underwhelmed with the main cast and crew of Black Ops 6. Russell Adler and Frank Woods are the only returning characters from Black Ops Cold War, and I absolutely have no complaints about Adler. His character is written to be pretty badass, which is aided by the strong performance from the voice actor Bruce Thomas. Black Ops Cold War was somewhat controversial within the fanbase for recasting the returning characters from the original game. In the most recent entry, the new voice actor for Woods returns, and although I've never had any complaints for his performance, it's still nowhere near as gripping as the performance by James C. Burns.
Carpe fucking diem. Well, guess what? If we're really doing this, we've got to get financially creative.
No talk, shoot one gun. You're the fuse. I'm the fuse. Bang! You can't kill me! Bang, bang, bang! You shoot, you shoot!
However, the most disappointing character is the one that happens to appear on the main cover, Marshall. I think the actor for Marshall does a great job, and maybe I'm letting too much of my own bias shine through, but I really wish they made him the son of Bowman, who died in the first game. I think my biggest complaint about the characters is that there aren't enough connections to the previous game. I know that in the Black Ops universe, Jason Hudson and Alex Mason both died in Panama just a few years before the Gulf War in Black Ops 6, but outside of Adler and Woods, there are no returning Black Ops veterans. I wouldn't be complaining about this if the new set of characters were memorable. Marshall's perfectly fine, I just wish he was either the main character or at least the son of Bowman. I think what makes the characters so underwhelming is that most of their development occurs outside of cutscenes, and optional moments that impatient players like myself will skip over as they start the next mission. Maybe I would have been compelled to sit through these fly-on-the-wall moments or partake in optional conversations if the main character was actually a character himself. In Black Ops 6, you play as the voiceless protagonist named Case, after playing as the voiceless protagonist named Bell in Black Ops Cold War. Case doesn't even feel like a real character, as the pre-rendered cutscenes never show him, and most of the dialogue options occur in optional conversations. Compared to Cold War, which allowed you to customize the race and gender of Bell, while incorporating dialogue options into key story moments that allowed you to affect the ending of the game. I feel like the story would have been much more compelling if instead we played as Marshall, who was the son of Bowman, which would have given the character an emotional connection to Frank Woods. Overall, I have a lot of issues with Black Ops 6, mainly stemming from its disappointing depiction of the Gulf War period, lack of real history or famous figures, and an underwhelming cast of characters. The main campaign of Black Ops 6 is much closer to being a 7 out of 10 compared to the 9 out of 10 that IGN gave it. Is it one of the better Call of Duty campaigns? Yeah, especially after Modern Warfare 3 and Call of Duty Vanguard, but I still prefer the Sicario-inspired story of Modern Warfare 2, the authentic 1980s setting of Cold War, and the revolutionary franchise reboot of Modern Warfare 2019. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing as I post detailed video essays like this one about video games and other media every 2 weeks. Let me know in the comments what you think about Black Ops 6, and let me know if you think it's a worthy addition to the Black Ops franchise. If you're new around here, I always give a sneak peek at the end of a video for the topic I'll be covering in the next one. For my next video, I'll be covering a forgotten Xbox One launch title just in time for Gladiator 2. Thank you for watching.